welcome to Answer Me 10, the podcast, with me, Barbara Dickson. Having been interviewed many times over the years, I'm always conscious of the generic nature of interviewing. And in my case, it usually begins with, "So Barbara, tell me, how did it all begin?" This has never exactly excited me, but I've always enjoyed reading those one-page affairs at the back of glossy magazines, which ask the same stereotypical questions to different people every week. Hugely diverse answers appear. So, I thought it would be fun to pose the same 10 questions to some other notable women in the world of music and see what different answers they would give. This is what Answer Me 10 with Barbara Dickson is all about. I hope you enjoy the journey with me. Today's guest is Scottish crime writer VAL McDERMID. She's perhaps best known for her Wire in the Blood series, featuring clinical psychologist Dr. Tony Hill and DCI Carol Jordan, which was adapted for television starring Robson Green and Hermione Norris. Her most recent TV series, Traces, aired on BBC One earlier this year, and a second series is currently in production. Val was chair of the Wellcome Book Prize in 2017 and has served as a judge for both the Women's Prize for Fiction and the 2018 Man Booker Prize. She's the recipient of 6 honorary doctorates and is an honorary fellow of St Hilda's College, Oxford. She's visiting professor in the Centre of Irish and Scottish Studies at the University of Otago in New Zealand. In her spare time, Val is also lead vocalist with the fun-loving Crime Writers, possibly the only band made up of crime writers ever to play at Glastonbury. Question 1. Town or country?
Well, the answer to that really is both. We have a house in Edinburgh and we have a place in a wee village in the East Neuk of Fife because my partner works at St Andrews University, so it's handy for her to commute from there rather than from Edinburgh. But a lot of my work is in the city, so we've got the best of both worlds. It's funny because I grew up by the sea in Fife, in Kirkcaldy and East Weems, and so I get a bit antsy if I'm not by the sea for a long period of time. Jo says, my partner, she says, I'm a bit like a dug. I need to be walked by the sea from time to time or I get restless.
Now, of course, you know the premise of this programme is you're not actually allowed to have both. This is not allowed. You can't say this. You have to have a preference in your soul for one or the other. Now, I know that I've heard, and very clearly you've explained why you've got 2 houses, but which do you prefer? Come on now.
Well, if you forced me into a corner, Barbara, and said I had to give up one, I'd probably give up the city because I love to be by the sea. I love that I can walk out my front door and be straight onto the Fife coastal path and walk for a short distance or a long distance, depending on what kind of mood I'm in. And whatever the weather is, it changes every day, the sea, the sky, the view. So for me, it's the perfect stimulus to think about what I'm working on. It frees up my head, if you like, to be by water and particularly to be by the sea.
Do you feel that it kind of feeds your soul, just the actual atmosphere of being there, seeing the water, sniffing the air?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly relaxes me. I mean, I literally feel my shoulders drop when I get out of the car and I smell the sea air. And as I say, to walk along the coast is for me the perfect way of unjamming when my head gets stuck when I'm writing. And there's always those moments where you think, I'm not quite sure how to do this next bit. I'm not quite sure where this conversation between these 2 characters is going. So I can go out and I can walk by the sea and I can have a think and I have a conversation with myself. And it doesn't really matter if people passing me by think I'm a bit mad because, mad people walk by the sea all the time.
Famously mad. But actually, the lovely thing about this is the complexity of your writing, Val, is such that you would need to take time out, I'm sure. I mean, I'm not an author, but I'm sure that you do need to do that just to sort of unravel things in your head before you commit them to the computer. Or I almost said paper there, isn't that? Shows you how old I am.
Well, I still edit on paper. I write on screen, but when it comes to actually editing my text, I do it on paper because I feel that I never read properly on screen, not quite in the same way, not with the same degree of focus that I do on paper. And maybe that's just
Yes.
my age, but I don't
No,
know.
I don't know. I don't know. I think that's interesting. It's like it becomes a book when you're doing that, doesn't it? It's much more like a book, the experience.
Yeah, and it just, as I say, I seem to read with more attention. I think we're so accustomed to skimming things on screen. I think, when we're skimming down Facebook or Twitter or skimming down the news, that actually focusing in tightly on a piece of writing is more difficult. We've got out of the habit of that when it comes to looking at a screen. So for me, it is important to have that on paper in front of me, where
Yes.
there's no distraction as well. There's nothing to click. Uh,
Yes.
it's just the
Yes.
words on the page and my
Yes.
head.
Question 2, meat or veg?
Well, I do enjoy my vegetables, but I have to say I do love my meat and my fish. And living in Scotland these days is one of the things that's been transformed since I was growing up. The availability of really good local produce has grown enormously. And we go to the market on Sunday and we buy fabulous venison. We've got a fish wholesaler here in the village, and we can just walk up 5 minutes up the road and get freshly caught lobster for a tenner. Whack it on the barbecue, and then the next day the next night you've got the shells. You can make a bisque. So nothing gets
Now,
wasted, obviously.
what about killing the lobster? Because I was up in the Highlands recently and everybody was talking about how best to kill lobsters. Do you get the fishmonger to kill the lobster, then you take it home, or do you deal with it yourself? She said euphemistically.
Well, I get the fishmonger to do it because I know that he could do it properly, humanely, and quickly. And
Yes.
he does the sort of straight to the head and down, cuts it in half.
Yes. Yes, that's right.
So
That's right. And having it cut in half is a fantastic, fantastic luxury, because I don't know about you. I once went to a dinner party years and years ago, and lobster was on the table. But of course, the lobster was put on the table on everybody's plate. Everybody had a lobster, and I went, "Oh, how am I going to deal with this?" Because I do love shellfish, but it's the actual negotiation of getting into the claws and all that stuff. Do you suck the claws and all
we
that?
soak everything. We pick everything. We soak everything. And I love a crab claw as well. But the only way to get into a crab claw really is to hit it with a hammer. There's nothing gracious about eating shellfish.
No. It reminds me of that scene years ago in the film Tom Jones with Albert Finney when they were having that sort of lascivious meal.
Mm. Yeah.
It's just...
I also think you really need to be very, very good friends with people that you eat lobster or crab or things like that.
I think you're absolutely right. You can't do that with strangers. You couldn't do that at a business lunch, could you?
No. Business lunches. I'll have the sea bass, thank you.
You're an omnivore, and I'm getting from you, Val, that as long as you know the origins of the food you eat, you're happy to eat meat, and the ethical aspect of it is absolutely fine. I mean, I'm saying this, I'm kind of putting words in your mouth because I feel much the same, but I don't know, is that how you feel?
I think it's a very complicated issue, Barbara. I'm deeply opposed to any kind of factory farming. But on the other hand, I think ethically raised animals, eating them is kind of what they're for. People talk about rare breeds. And I know from talking to people who raise rare breeds that the rare breeds wouldn't be there if we didn't eat them, for example.
Yes.
And if we all became vegan overnight, what are you going to do with all the cows, all the sheep, all the pigs, all the domestic animals? Because they have no function other than that.
I remember a friend of mine telling me this. It's got to be 45 years ago, and I agree entirely with you on that. I mean, I certainly awful lot of young people feel very, very strongly about this. But you're right. I mean, you would not drive past those lovely herds of Aberdeen Angus in fields, a pedigree herd with its bull, like I did the other day, and go in amongst them and scratch his nose, with a stick.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have that wonderful experience if they weren't being eaten and they weren't being developed in that way. I agree entirely. Question 3: TV, film, or books?
Well, obviously, for me as a writer, it would have to be the books. I'm never without a book. Really, I've had this addiction since childhood. When I was wee, my mum took me to the library before I could read, and she would wheel me across the council estate in my pushchair to the branch library and read me picture books. And when I was 6, we moved house to live opposite the Central Library in Kirkcaldy, and that was my home from home. And I just essentially read my way around the shelves, and I loved that sense of escaping into all these other worlds. I was an only child, and only children back in those days, you had to be seen and not heard. You were expected to sit around while the adults talked and behave yourself. But for me, there was no hardship at all. I'd often sit under the table with a book, and I was perfectly happy. Having said that, of course, like all of us in lockdown, I have worked my way through much of Netflix and iPlayer in the evenings because there is something more sociable about sitting and watching the telly together than there is about sitting both reading a book. Although
indeed, yeah, there's a different sort of escapism, isn't there? And it is more of a shared experience. But I find that if I'm left on my own, my husband's away, I tend to, I always read as well, but only at specific times of the day, usually, unless I'm on holiday. But I love to look at sort of particularly sort of Scandi noir stuff like that, and always drama on Netflix or something like that, just as a kind of relaxation, a different kind of relaxation to reading a book. So I really understand what you're saying there.
Well, it's less interactive as well, watching TV and film, because you're spoon-fed. You see the characters, you hear the characters. But when you're reading a book, you bring your own experience of the world, your own experience of life to what you're reading, and that creates the pictures in your head. It's not all spoon-fed in the way that a film or a book is. And I mean, I get absorbed in reading. It's like the world can go on around me and I'm just not noticing. I did actually once give myself a black eye walking into a wall while reading.
The wonderful thing, as you say, about reading is that this leads to this extraordinary thing that lots of people say when they do see a book come to life on film or a drama on television, and they say, no, he was nothing like that. Yeah. He didn't look anything like that at all, because they know in their head what that person looked like. They have a very strong image.
Absolutely. When we made the Why on the Blood television series, I was delighted to have Robson Green playing Tony Hill, because he was very, very like the Tony Hill in my head. In fact, that first description of him and the mermaids singing could be a description of Robson.
Did you describe him to the casting people then, or did the casting people just do that? Was that a coincidence, really?
Yeah, well, it was Robson's television company that made the series. So they came to us saying, we'd like to option these books and make them a television series. And I knew Robson was a good enough actor to play it. And as I say, in my head, he looked right for the part. And as we talked about the books and how he perceived them and how the producers saw the series developing, I thought, this is going to be great. We can work together. And the bonus is that he looks like the man in my head. But it's amazing how many people come up to me and go, Robson Green looked nothing like Tony Hill. And I'm thinking,
I love that. That is just so brilliant. But so often you do see somebody and you don't quite know what it is, but very often, because I have acted as well, and my husband works in television, as you know, and very often we watch something on television and we say, I don't know why they cast that person, because they're nothing like it, or they don't seem right for the part. It's not really, it sounds like a personal criticism about the performance, but it isn't really. It's much more subtle than that. It is, as you say, interesting what you have in your head when you're reading, because it is the such a world of imagination.
And it stays with you no matter whether you see a television or film adaptation where the person doesn't look like what's in your head. Because although Robson Green looked very like Tony Hill in my head, Hermione Norris, who did a brilliant job as Carol Jordan, is not the Carol Jordan in my head. And I still have my Carol Jordan. So when I'm writing those characters, I see the Carol Jordan in my head untouched by Hermione's presence.
I'm glad, because you are creating more life for those characters, and we are the better for it. So it's just as well you haven't had your view of that character sort of hijacked in some way. That's really interesting.
But it can go the other way. I mean, a very good friend of mine had her books adapted for television, and it was an appalling adaptation, and it was terrible casting. And it completely destroyed her character for her. She had to stop writing those books and write something different.
Question 4. Night owl or early riser?
Well, by nature, I'm a night owl. I've always been better in the evening. And quite often when I'm actually in the later stages of writing a book, I'll go back to work after dinner and do a bit more work, sometimes writing into the small hours. But I've always said my body clock would be go to bed at 1 o'clock and wake up at 9. But since lockdown, I don't know if it's lockdown or if it's age, I've started waking earlier. And these days, I'm often awake at 7 o'clock and ready to go.
You're using this earlier time for writing, the quietness.
No, I'm wandering about the house with a cup of coffee going, why am I awake?
Okay. So you haven't adjusted properly to this yet.
No, not really. I don't go, oh, good, I'm awake early. I can get an extra 2 hours work done.
Because I've read of authors who say, I get up at 5 a.m. because the house is so quiet then, and I write for 4 hours and then I have my breakfast. Yeah. So you're not at that stage yet. No, absolutely not.
I think that we all have times of the day, I think, where we're more productive than others. So, for example, I know I always have a real burst of energy around about 11 o'clock in the morning, and that's a real burst then. And I always have a big burst of energy about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And other times of the day where, I know I can sort of plug into sort of energy resource. I tend to work in 20-minute bursts. I'll write furiously for 20 minutes, then I'll do something else. I don't know, look at Twitter, make a cup of coffee, go for a wee walk.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a bit like rehearsing. What I used to say was I used to make everybody knuckle down when we were rehearsing. And I think it was because I was worried about getting there myself with what we were doing. And I used to, say, come on, blah, 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 back to blah, 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 blah. And then I found out as time went by, that's rubbish. That's better, much better to do short bursts and then let everybody go off and have a cup of tea and a chat and stuff. Come back, you get much more achieved that way.
Yeah, I think so, because your brain does something else and you use a different bit of your brain. So when you come back to the work, it's almost refreshed. It's almost as if, I often think the subconscious does a lot of work for us when we're busy doing something else. I often set myself, if I'm worried about the next scene, or I'm not sure quite how I'm going to do a transition, or quite where this relationship with the characters is going in the next section, I'll kind of talk to myself at bedtime. I'll have a wee conversation with myself at bedtime, ask the questions, go to sleep. In the morning, get in the shower, there's the answer.
It's fascinating. Yes, I do believe in this. I believe that makes perfect sense to me. As a musician, these things happen as well. It is really interesting what happens if you're writing, creating music or arranging something that's particularly difficult. That it does work, I know.
I think it's something about using one part of your brain, a different kind of thinking, a different kind of energy, that your subconscious gets on with it and does the work for you when you're looking somewhere else. So in the corner of your eye, it's there working away for you.
That's right. John, the great John Byrne said to me, I said something like, how could he paint 30, whatever it was, pictures in just over a month, which is what he did a few years ago. And he said, I just get out of the way and let my subconscious take over. And that's really interesting. There's a creative person who is completely in touch with that side of his brain. And of course, visual arts are different again, aren't they? I mean, if you get out of the way, you can, because I find this really difficult as a control freak, I'm sort of making things happen, but actually I'd be much better just shutting up and getting out of the way and let things flow.
Sometimes it's hard to let go because when you are creating, as we're creating, if you don't do the creation, it doesn't happen. So there's sometimes a sense of panic about it. But letting go is a great assistance to the creative flow, I think.
Question 5, faith or fatalism?
Well, I grew up, as so many of us did, in the Church of Scotland, going to the church every Sunday, going to the Sunday school and all that. And I found it quite interesting, but I somehow could never quite get my head around a sense of complete belief. So I would say that my position these days is that this life is the only one we've got. And what we have to do is make the best of it that we can, but also that we show kindness, that we show generosity, that we are decent with other people.
Yes.
Because we're not going to get a second bite of the cherry. If you don't get it right this time, you're not going to get it right any time.
It is interesting, actually, because there are many people who have no faith whatsoever who almost criticize people of faith because they say things like, you don't have the exclusive rights to these good things and this moral code. I understand that. I am a person of faith because I do. Yeah. I do go to church, but I don't think it's only Christians in Scotland that feel these things. The most so-called primitive people who are not primitive at all and have marvelous kind of civilizations are brought up with a moral code. There's certain things you don't do.
I have no issue with people of faith, and many of my friends are indeed people of devout faith. What I have a problem with faith is, I suppose, the organised structures that are used to oppress people and control people.
Yeah, fundamentalism, I think you're talking about there, and that is a very, very bad thing in any faith at all.
Yeah, so I have a lot of respect for people who have found that faith in their lives, but it's never been there for me.
Val, you've never had that sort of romanticism where you've thought the kind of what's furry will no go by you, that kind of thing.
I think a lot of our fate, if you like, a lot of our fate is what we make it. It's where we place our focus and how we work towards achieving that focus. And I'm not saying that in a sort of goody two-shoes kind of way. I know that many people don't have the kind of good fortune and the kind of choices I have had. But I think a lot of our outcomes are predicated on our own decisions.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. But sometimes people find it difficult to make decisions, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And sometimes people's options are so tightly limited that in a real sense, they don't have a choice.
Yes.
And that's where, for those of us who do have choices, who do have options, I think there's a kind of obligation on us to try and help other people's lives to be better.
And you're an educated person as well, and you have, as you say, come from a very humble background and done very well, but you do feel a sense of responsibility towards the world, and that's very good.
My parents kind of brought me up with this belief that if you were fortunate enough to do well, then you had an obligation to put something back.
Of course you do. I agree entirely with that, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that teaching. And I think, I think my parents were much the same as well. It was just the way of the world then, that post, I know I'm older than you, but the sort of post-war generation, we were very lucky, us children, to be brought up the way we were, with parents who had experienced the early 20th century with the terribleness of what had happened in their lives and their world. It was a chaotic world.
We've been, in many ways, we've had the best of it, Barbara.
Question 6, Facebook or the phone?
I almost never use the phone anymore, I have to say. I've been talking to people on Zoom a lot during lockdown or FaceTime because it's in the absence of having people's presence, at least being able to see them on the screen is some consolation for their absence. I'm not a Facebook person at all, though. I find Facebook... I'm concerned about the way that Facebook use my data, if you like. So I'm a Twitter person, really.
So do you, Val, have somebody who does your Facebook for you? I mean, do you need Facebook for your work, do you? I mean, I know musicians tend to. We all have Facebook, but I don't do mine, for example.
Yeah, my people. My publicist and my marketing people do my Facebook page, and I have input into that. You know, I shove things their way that I think should be out there.
Yes, yeah.
I don't actively engage myself.
We kind of need it for our work, and it's so brilliant to be able to let people know there's a new Val McDermid book out or a new Barbara Dickson album. Yeah. And they all, if they're interested, they know immediately that it's there and they can go and get it. And it is a great, great bonus to us. But in one's personal life, would you pick up the phone and ring a friend or not?
I would probably tend to do a FaceTime with them, or I would message them and say, "Are you around for a chat?"
I find that in my personal life, I tend to use the telephone. I don't use the telephone very much, so that's the first thing with me. But when I do use the telephone, it's for my personal friends and for the people that I feel would appreciate a phone call. And I don't text them, and I don't do Facebook. As I say, I would not email anybody who's very close to me, I don't think. But I find the phone has disappeared sort of out of my life to a large extent, which is, I think, what you've said as well.
Yeah, and I have a tendency, if I see a call coming in from a number I don't recognise, I let it go to voicemail.
Quite right.
Because you know, there are ways for people to get in touch with me professionally that don't involve actually speaking to me on the phone.
Yes.
It feels like an invasion of my space somehow.
Yes, I think we've become like this, but I think it's quite good that you communicate with people when you have the time and the space to do it. And if they come at you when you're busy or having a think or doing something else or walking along the coastal path, you don't really want to pick up your phone and disturb your thought processes in that way. This is what this has done for us, the internet has done for us, has given us the time to step back and contact them when we have the time to do it.
Yeah, and you can go like, you know, I don't have the headspace for this conversation now. No, because I'm in the middle of something else, or there's just too many things going on today for me to be able to focus on you. So we'll communicate at a time when we're both able to think about what we're saying and what we want to communicate to each other, whether that's my son or whether it's my publicist or whether it's a journalist. Sometimes
you look at the phone and it is someone you really like and you go, I'm not in the mood.
Yeah.
And that is, I always go, because I'm sort of riddled with guilt from my background, I go, oh God, I should have picked that up. Oh my goodness, I should have done that. Anyway, it's the mafia of the mind. And if you're busy, you're busy. So that's the end of that.
That's a great expression. I'm going to steal that.
Yeah, I did once get that from one of those crazy American consciousness books, but I thought it was so funny. I've kept it. Guilt is the mafia of the mind. Question 7. Shower or bath?
Shower every time. I've not had a bath this millennium.
So you are on the run then. You are busy, busy, busy woman.
Well, it's partly that, but it's also partly I don't feel any pleasure in sort of wallowing around in my own filth, you know. It's just kind of how I feel about a bath.
That's so Presbyterian, Valerie.
Yeah, well, you know, I just love I love the sensation of a shower as well. I love that sort of almost. It's almost like it's cleansing your spirit as well as your body. And as I was saying earlier, you know, very often the shower is where the idea coalesces that I've been sleeping on, as it were.
So do you have a long shower? Would you have a long shower then?
No, I tend to have a pretty quick shower because the idea forms and you need to get out of the shower and make a note of it before it disappears, you know.
Right, so I'm going to advise in my podcast, all creative people get in the shower immediately so that their ideas start flowing. So you would never think of having a bath and just lying there and luxuriating in warm water and the smell of aromatherapy oil. It's not for you.
Definitely not for me. No. It's too much palaver, Barbara. You've got to get the right oils in the bath, and then you've got to get in the bath, and you've got to make sure the temperature's right and keep adjusting it. And if you drop your book in the bath, and it's just too complicated.
Don't read in the bath. A lot of people, I know, the lovely Kiki D told me in the podcast, I couldn't believe this. She was talking about being in a health club, the same health club as the comedian Dave Allen. And she says she went past the steam room in the health club one day, and there was Dave Allen in the steam room with a broadsheet newspaper. Imagine trying to read that.
That would be complicated. I mean, you turn the page and suddenly you find you're dressed in your broadsheet newspaper. It's sticking to you. And
yes, exactly. Pulling bits of it. I couldn't believe it, but it's a fantastic image. I love Dave Allen, and I love that story. Question 8. Spring or autumn?
Well, I love autumn. I love the colours of autumn. I love the textures of autumn. There's nothing lovelier than scuffing through the leaves on a chill morning as the winter approaches. The blue skies. Here on the East Coast, we get amazing blue skies, don't we, Barbara? I mean, we get these fabulous big skies, and it just feels so. It just draws you in. As I said, the changing colours, the landscape's changing. We're coming into that period of hibernation, and winter is when I write. So for me, the autumn is as it were, the promise of the creativity that's to come. For quite a long time in my career, I found myself abroad a lot, particularly touring in America in sort of October time. And I kept missing the autumn. I kept missing that magic moment when the colours change and the year turns. And I'd come back and I felt cheated. I felt robbed of the autumn.
It's so interesting, this, because some people feel sad in the autumn because they see things sort of battening down for the winter. You've just talked about that in a positive sense. And other people are very happy for it to be autumn because they think, oh, gosh, the lovely winter hygge season's coming in, with the sort of the mulled wine and Christmas and all those kind of cozy things. And the one thing somebody said to me, which I really remembered, was that, of course, it's not, and things are not dying in the autumn. They're just under the ground, moving and preparing. So there's this fantastic continuity to life, which is reflected in this process as well. You in the East Nuke there with that sky, it's like being on top of the world, I think, in the East Nuke.
Yes. And it's funny you're saying there about the autumn, and I remember when my son was really wee, and I think it must have been his sort of second autumn, and so he'd have been coming up for 2, I suppose. And the leaves were all coming off the trees, and he just burst into tears. He says, "The trees are all dying."
Oh, poor wee soul.
Because he'd forgotten about spring, because it barely touched his consciousness. I had to explain to him, it's all right, darling, this is going to happen every year. It's okay to come back in the spring. They're greener again in the spring. It's okay. But he had that complete sort of, this is a terrible thing. The trees are all dying.
And it's life, isn't it? It's the movement, the progression of time and life moving on. Things sort of they're not closing down really. They're just kind of moving on to a new stage. But it is extraordinary how most people seem to prefer the spring, because there is that immediate. It's a kind of show. It's like the end of a catwalk show, when the big frock comes on. People, because everything bursts into life. And I think this is the thing I find interesting, is that we forget in the winter that spring is going to happen. Every year it's a surprise when a wee a snowdrop pops its head up. It's like you've never seen one before.
Yeah, there's the little dwarf irises, the Irish reticulata, the either blue or purple. They just suddenly they're there. One day there's nothing, and then the next day there's this sort of blurt of colour.
Yeah, and they're so blousy, aren't they? They're
Yeah.
so blousy. Unlike the little snowdrop, a little white flower, they're so blousy, the iris. So I really understand. But isn't it wonderful that we are in a climate where, despite the things that are happening to change it, we do have these wonderful changes, because a friend of mine went to live in the West Indies and she said hardly anything changed from season to season.
Yeah.
It was much, much more subtle. I mean, the local people, of course, said, oh, yes, this is spring. They would be shown a photograph and they'd know exactly, like we are when we see pictures of daffodils. That was filmed in March. But they're much the same. But she said she couldn't really tell what the difference was. It was so subtle.
Yeah, I'd find that difficult. And we were in New Zealand a couple of years ago for 3 months in autumn, our autumn, but their spring, and it was very weird to have that sort of shift of the seasons. Because we were there, for quite a long period, and it did my head in, really. I had to really work to adjust to coming back to the dead of winter, just as I'd been going into summer.
And it was it's so interesting because it's the same but topsy-turvy, isn't it?
Yeah.
In New Zealand, you've got the same big changes, but the other way around.
Yeah.
It must have been really bizarre.
And a landscape in this island where we were that is very similar to Scotland as well. So
Yes.
It felt like a Scottish spring with the blossom and the gorse and things like that. And then coming back, wait a minute, this is winter. This is strange.
I know.
It's all wrong.
Peculiar. Question 9. Dine out or take out?
Well, it would be dine out every time. We love to dine out, either just the two of us to celebrate something or with friends. And if we're having people round to the house, then we'll cook. We love to cook. We both cook well, and we love having friends around. But as I say, it's really lovely to go out with friends. We went out on Saturday night for the first time in a very long time with friends. And the joy of sitting around a table in a restaurant with 4 friends and the crack, the laughter, the joy of each other's company. The time flew past. We couldn't believe it when it was like they're throwing us out because it's closing time. We're going like, no, surely not. We've only been here an hour.
And the wonderful thing about this is that now it is, although we've been able to see the people that are very close to us, we're able now to get into a larger group of people. So as you say, to be able to sit down with a few people having supper and hearing and these different strands of conversation coming at you, your brain is working in a completely different way to how it's done for a year and a half.
Yes, because unlike Zoom, where you really have to wait for somebody to finish speaking because you can't speak together, when there's 6 of you sitting around a table, there's often 3 different conversations going on at once.
The laughing and the as you say, the interjections and the people talking across each other in a natural form. It's wonderful. It's so exciting. I cannot wait to get together with my beloved brother. I have one brother who lives in Canada and I haven't seen him yet. And he's been together with his son who lives in London. So the son went to Canada with his girlfriend and they sent me a picture of them, the family together. And I thought, oh, that just looks so wonderful. And I would love to take him in my arms as well. I love him. He's still my wee brother and he's 70.
But
isn't that dear?
It's lovely, and we also love having people round as well. And I always think that cooking for someone, taking the time and trouble to make a nice meal, it's an act of love, isn't it? It's an act of friendship.
That's so wonderful you say that, because I, having cooked for a family all my life, I haven't got the pleasure in cooking. I don't mind making puddings because there's no pressure, but I always feel rather pressured with main courses. And I do feel rather nervous that it's going to work out okay. I don't know what that is about, but it doesn't stop me doing it, Val. You know,
Thank goodness for that, Barbara.
I'm a courageous woman. I will actually say, I don't know if this is going to be any good, folks, but here it is anyway. But I can't say, and it is an act of love. To feed people is to love them and to be generous of spirit. And I'm still working at it at my advanced age. Question 10. High heels or trainers?
Well, it's trainers every time for me, because I like to be able to just sort of beast up the hill or beast along the street. In my years as a journalist, you always had to be pretty smartly dressed, because you went into the office in the morning, you never knew what the day might hold. You could find yourself in the city chambers, or you could find yourself clambering down a motorway embankment to cover a fatal crash. But you had to be respectable, as it were. And in those days, being respectable meant you had to have heels on. And I remember when I left my day job in 1991 to be a full-time writer, I remember saying, I never have to wear high heels again. I can be comfortable, and through this pandemic, we've seen Nicola Sturgeon getting up to her podium every day in her peery heels, and I feel for her. I think your feet must be killing you.
I think it's to do with being wee. I think we people want to wear heels, and to some extent it is a power thing, just to get up to the same eye level as everyone else. But I have abandoned sort of heels. I mean, I'm looking at the wee Olympic girl who's been commenting on the Olympics this year with her massive heels. I've been looking at them and thinking she's a little person as well who wants to look bigger. But I tend to wear either boots with stacked heels, but but high, because on stage, I think it's good to be lifted up somehow. It gives you good leg line. I mean, I did once fall over backwards over a monitor. I slid slowly into the sunset by have the monitor fold me behind my knees, and back I went like a far-welted sheep. Over the back of the monitor. So I don't wear skinny heels. Now, Val, it has been such a pleasure to talk to you. It's always a pleasure to share half an hour with you. And thank you for being part of Answer Me 10 and being my guest. It's been just great.
It's been an absolute joy, Barbara. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Answer Me 10 with me, Barbara Dickson. This podcast was recorded in Edinburgh in 2021 and produced and edited by Lee Noble and John Eden.